This is the new Nintendo Switch OLED, and right before I got it, I had 15 burning questions that I can now finally answer. With the first one being how easy it is to actually transfer your data from your current Switch to the brand new Switch OLED. And the answer is not as easy as you might think, as the only thing that you can transfer are the saved game files, which are only a few megabytes in size. There's no way to transfer your games, which means that you will need to log into your Nintendo account and manually re-download each game individually. I was downloading about 10 games, which took almost an entire day due to how slow the Switch's Wi-Fi was. One thing to note here is that Animal Crossing has a completely different save game transfer process that you have to initiate through the game itself. Okay, so you all know by now that this new Switch OLED has an OLED display, which is also noticeably larger at 7 inches versus 6.2, but is this new display any brighter, as the old Switch was indeed quite dim? And here, we used our professional measuring tool, and we found out that if you manually max out the brightness with auto brightness disabled, the regular Switch would go up to 328 nits, while the OLED model would go up to 292, so it is a tiny bit dimmer unfortunately. Then we enabled auto brightness, and in the exact same lighting conditions, the regular Switch defaulted to 244 nits, while the OLED model defaulted to 155, once again, much lower. Of course, that if you have loads of light, then both switches would reach their maximum brightness level of 328 and 292 nits, but I have noticed that the OLED model tends to limit the brightness more than the regular model does, likely to save battery life and to prevent potential burn-in. However, even though the display got brighter, the resolution has remained the same at 720p, so my question here is this new display noticeably more pixelated than before? And the answer is, unfortunately, yes. If you look closely, you can very easily tell that the new Switch OLED has fewer pixels per inch, as a lot of the finer text and detail is lost on the newer model when compared to the old one. Even when I had both in a tabletop mode, I could easily see some jagged edges and pixelation on the Switch OLED, but when I was in a game, I honestly forgot about it entirely. One thing to add here is that the Switch OLED uses a full RGB subpixel matrix rather than pentile, like most OLED displays use, which makes it a bit sharper than other 720p OLED screens. I guess that Nintendo made this decision in order to minimize the drop in pixel density as much as they could. Now, everyone knows that OLED displays are way more vibrant than LCDs unless the manufacturer adds a color profile to make it look more natural. So I was really curious if Nintendo has left the display in its normal vibrant mode or if they changed it to a more natural look. And the answer here is that they've actually done both. By default, you get the vibrant mode, which looks so much better than the old Switch. There's honestly no comparison, everything pops and it literally makes you feel like you're part of that game world. However, if you do prefer a less vibrant look, there's also the standard profile, which will bring the colors more in line to how they looked on the regular Switch. And fun fact, even the standard mode is still more vibrant than the old display. Now, one of the main issues with the original Switch was the fact that the display was made out of plastic instead of glass, which did make it more resistant to cracks when dropped, but it also made it extremely susceptible to scratches to the point where having a glass screen protector was a must. So I was wondering, does the new Switch OLED finally have a glass display now? And good news, it absolutely does. Which means that number one, your display would finally be more durable when it comes to scratches, and having a screen protector day one is no longer a requirement. Number two, the display is also finally laminated, whereas on the regular Switch, there was this air gap between the plastic layer and the actual LCD display. And number three, the regular Switch had this green tone that was very visible when the console was off, which not only made it look super cheap, but also created a lot of reflections, which are now significantly reduced, plus we have a pure black screen on the OLED model, which perfectly blends in with the bezels. So now that we've clarified the display, are there any form factor differences between the two Switches? And yes, there are. So the height is identical, but the OLED model is slightly wider by 3mm and also heavier by 23 grams. Now, I personally haven't really noticed the weight increase at all, but I did in fact notice the increase in width. Which begs the question, can you still use the old Switch cases and grip attachments on the Switch OLED? Well, my case works perfectly fine, and I'm pretty sure that even if you have a super precise case, that would still work, as cases are made out of a softer, more flexible material. However, when it comes to grip attachments, the one that I have does not actually work, and I'm pretty sure that most of them out there won't work either, as grip attachments are usually made out of rigid plastic and they are manufactured to the exact dimensions of the regular Switch. Question 8. Aside from the extra width and weight, are there any other visible changes in terms of the new Switch? And to my surprise, there are. And I found 8 of them. The biggest one by far being the new stand, which, in case you're wondering, no, it is not removable anymore, but it does offer you multiple viewing angles as opposed to the single one that the original Switch had. This new stand is also made out of metal, so it feels a lot more premium, and the second big change is that the body itself is also made out of a more premium plastic now. It's got this grainy feel to it as opposed to the glossy feel of before, and it is also less susceptible to smudges now. Then at number 3, the volume and the power buttons have been redesigned as well, with the volume buttons especially being much easier to press thanks to their longer shape. Number 4, the air vent has also been redesigned with smaller cuts, likely to limit the amount of dust that can get in. Number 5, the game card slot is now lacking the lip to open it easily, which I'm not a fan of, but again, I don't really use game cards anyways. Then the speaker grill has been repositioned from the back of the console to the bottom, with additional openings below the screen as opposed to onto the screen. Number 7, the microSD card slot has also been repositioned from a vertical orientation to an horizontal one. And this is also sloped, likely to prevent the card from accidentally falling out. That never happened to me, by the way, but I guess that it's good to have just in case. And then finally, the last design change that I have noticed is that the regulatory text has been moved from the back of the console to underneath the kickstand, which does give the Switch a cleaner look. Oh, and if you're enjoying this video, feel free to subscribe, as we might do more Switch content if this video is well received. Another thing that I was really curious to see was if these new Joy-Cons work with the older Switch and if the old Joy-Cons work with the new Switch. And the answer is yes to both. So if you have any limited edition Joy-Cons, those would still work with the Switch OLED. Now, Nintendo kept praising the new speakers, saying that the sound quality has been improved. So I was wondering, in what way? Are they louder? Or are they just clearer? So I tried the speakers in both games and music on YouTube, and the OLED model was always 2 to 3 decibels louder. But the big difference between the two was in terms of the overall sound quality, with the OLED model being richer, with a deeper bass and noticeably clearer. Just listen for yourselves. And even though the processor inside the Switch OLED hasn't changed, I was still curious to see if the battery life would be any different, as we do have a larger display, but one that is also more power efficient. So I played 1 hour of Metroid Dread on both of these consoles, and from 100%, the regular Switch dropped to 83, while the OLED model dropped to 85. Now, this may make you think that the OLED has a better battery life, but do keep in mind that I got my Redbox Switch when it originally came out in 2019, so the battery health is no longer pristine. So the main takeaway here is that you shouldn't really expect to see any major difference in terms of the battery life between the two, despite the OLED model having a larger display. Even Nintendo rates them the same. Question 12. Is this new charger any different from the previous one? And more importantly, can you finally use a third-party charger to power the new dock? Or do you still have to use Nintendo's own charger? The charger is the exact same size as the old one, with the only difference being the text on the back, which now shows the total wattage, although this is exactly the same as before. And the second difference is that the manufacturing country seems to have changed from the Philippines to China. That's it. When it comes to using third-party chargers to power the dock, I tried a couple, including my own MacBook charger, and the dock actually worked perfectly. And I then tried the old dock with the same charger and the old Switch, and to my surprise, it also worked. The MacBook charger 100% did not work with the old dock and the old Switch. I could never use it when I was traveling, so it looks like Nintendo did actually change something with the latest software updates, as even the old dock does seem to work with the same third-party chargers as the new one does. Keep in mind they need to be 30 watts or more powerful than that in order for them to work. Now, one of the major issues with the previous dock was that it actually scratched the Switch's plastic display. I'm not even joking. So has this been fixed with the new dock? Well, the new dock does seem to have redesigned rubber pads on the inside, which should prevent scratches from happening, and since the display is now made out of glass, it is also more durable when it comes to scratches. I'm not saying that it won't scratch, but from my usage, this hasn't happened yet, and considering the improvements that Nintendo has made to the dock and to the Switch itself, I honestly don't see this being an issue anymore. But are there any other changes to the dock itself from, the obvious one, which is the fact that it's white now? Well, I think that the biggest one is that apparently this new dock does actually support 4K output at 60 Hz. The new Switch OLED does not, so it could be just that when the new Switch 4K launches, that's the name that I predict, which I also predict to launch in November 2022, I think that they would simply reuse this dock instead of launching a new one. Now, the second thing that I've noticed is that there is an update dock firmware option in the settings, which tells me that this new dock is indeed smarter and more capable than the old one, and it will receive updates in the future that could improve its performance. I've also noticed that the new dock is now more rounded to match the shape of the Switch, with the inside now being glossy as opposed to matte. And the back is now fully removable as opposed to just the door that opened, and of course, we have an Ethernet port instead of the previous USB port, and the 2 USB ports, by the way, are still there in case you are wondering. The Switch logo on the front is now smaller, and fun fact, if you want to use your old Switch with this new dock, you actually can. My last question is in terms of the performance. I know that the processor is identical, but I am curious to see if the cooling system is any different and if the overall performance in games has been improved. So when it comes to the cooling, I have actually noticed that the Switch OLED fan seems to stay off pretty much all the time, even when you're in intensive games, and when it is on, it seems to be running on the lowest possible setting, as I could barely hear it. Now, I haven't actually noticed any performance difference in games, aside from less ghosting in some fast-paced games like Mario Kart, but this isn't thanks to the processor changes, but rather thanks to the OLED screen, which is more responsive than the old OLED was. Digital Foundry did a great performance analysis, and they concluded that the frame rate is essentially identical between the two models. Okay, so as a conclusion, I am honestly very happy with the new Switch OLED. I think that if you're mostly a docked mode user, then there is no reason at all to upgrade, but if you are primarily a handheld user like I am, then the Switch OLED is a massive upgrade over the previous model. And not just the display, but also the kickstand and the overall build quality. But let me know, what do you guys think? I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Zen of Tech, signing out. Cheers.